G'day, I'm Sharyn. I've had sewing machines since I was about 5 and I got my first overlocker in 1989. What's the difference? Why do you have one or both? And what's the purpose of having two? First part, seams. The seam on the overlocker sewed the seam, trimmed the edges and did seam finishing all in one pass. The sewing machine just sewed the seam. It didn't finish anything off, it didn't trim anything off. So you'll need to go back with pinking shears or do some further sewing in order to make the edges happen. And that means that I can put a few ticks on here now. So the overlocker worked faster and did a better job at it. So I've given that 2 ticks. Stretch seams on an overlocker work exactly the same way that woven ones do, except they're stretchy. If you're trying to do a stretch seam on a sewing machine, you're going to need to do either a narrow-ish zigzag or a lightning stitch, both of which will be less stretchy than what you get out of an overlocker. More ticks. Overlocker gets 2 because it does a better job of stretch seams. I've put the ticks up for seam finishing. The overlocker got 2 because it's already done it as part of its seam. My sewing machine can absolutely do seam finishes. I can fold things under and stitch them down. I can put things together and zigzag them. It all takes more time than it takes on the overlocker. If I'm sewing the crotch seam on a pair of trousers, I will actually finish those seams first with the overlocker and then sew them with the sewing machine. So the overlocker gets a workout there as well. And that's why 2 ticks for the overlocker and just 1 for the sewing machine. By edge finishing, I mean maybe around the bottom of a pair of trousers, I want to finish that edge before I do the hem, so that I don't need to turn it up twice. Or it could be around the bottom of a skirt before I do a hem, or something that I think might fray. Now I can do those things with my sewing machine, but the overlocker does it faster and it actually trims it as it goes, which means if it's already started to fray, it'll fix it up. The sewing machine doesn't actually get rid of the frayed stuff. It just leaves it there. As a result, 2 ticks for the overlocker, it's easier and faster. 1 tick for the sewing machine. It does it, but it takes a bit longer and it's not as easy. Because the overlocker actually has a stretchy stitch, attaching necklines like this or putting a cuff on sleeves, on stretchy garments and so on, that's very, very easy with the overlocker. It is a bit less attractive when you do it with a sewing machine. So the sewing machine can certainly put rib trim on, but it's not going to look as nice and it's not going to have as much stretch to it. Now we move into a different area. Hems can't really be done by overlockers or sergers. They can put a band of ribbing around the bottom, but a blind hem or invisible hem, not really. You can try, but because they do a stitch every 5mm or a bit less than 1/4 of an inch, then even if you've got it all set up right and you only take the tiniest little bite out of that right side of the fabric, it's going to show up every 1/4 of an inch. Where I set my sewing machine up to do a blind hem, I only get that little bite every 1/2 to 2/3 of an inch. Sewing machine, much better. If you could even say that an overlocker could do it at all. So on my scoring system, sewing machine gets a mark for hems. The overlocker doesn't. Zippers. Your sewing machine can put in all sorts of zippers. Chunky zips, invisible zips, dress zips, metal zips, you name it. Your sewing machine is probably going to be able to do it. Your overlocker? No, it can't. So the sewing machine gets a mark for zippers and the overlocker does not. Unless you have a straight stitch only machine, your domestic sewing machine will do buttonholes. Even the most basic ones will do a 4-step buttonhole. The only ones that won't, straight stitch only machines, and if you buy an old attachment, you can make them do buttonholes as well. Your overlocker, not a chance. That's a win for the sewing machine. Top stitch and basting, same deal. The sewing machine can do them, the overlocker just can't. So that's where we've got it when I've worked out all the things that I can think of that I need to do when I'm making garments. And the sewing machine can do everything, but the overlocker can't. There's no point in buying an overlocker for your first machine because there are these things that it just can't do. Why then do so many people have overlockers or sergers? Well, if you notice, the things that it does do, it got 2 ticks for. It does those things super well. Really, really well. And once you get beyond doing basic sewing, and maybe you've decided, I really enjoy this, I want to take it to the next level, that's when you get an overlocker. And particularly when you work this out. These things that the overlocker does really well, they're the things you do most of when you're making garments. You sew seams, you sew stretch seams, you do seam finishing, edge finishing, you put trims on. That's where you spend most of your time. I estimate that I spend 80% of my time in that area. These things, I need to be able to do them, but they only actually take up about 20% of my time when I'm doing sewing. So whilst I need something to do them, that bit is amazingly helpful. And that's why I have multiple overlockers. So what does it all mean? It means you need to get a sewing machine first. If you have a high frustration level and you can persevere when things don't go quite right, any sewing machine is likely to do, as long as it's got a buttonhole. And almost all of them do. The lower end ones, it will be a 4-step buttonhole. It's hard to do 2 4-step buttonholes exactly the same size. If you get frustrated easily and you can afford it, I would recommend that you get an electronic sewing machine. One that does needle up down, has a lock stitch and a 1-step buttonhole. Life will be much easier for you. You'll be a much happier person if you've got those things available to you. When you go to get an overlocker or serger, there are 3 levels of machine: budget, mid-range, high-end. They all do basically the same things. They all trim the seams, they all do that nice edge finishing. The difference is how hard they are to thread. If you get a budget model, it is much more difficult to thread than a mid-range machine, which is more difficult to thread than the high-range ones which have air threading. Another little thing to think about, if there's anything that is a bit compromised with your vision, probably a black machine is not a good idea. I have recently seen some advertising for a machine that is definitely not easy thread, but they're saying it's easy thread. I have got a video about what to look for on overlockers, and it shows how hard they are to thread at each of those levels. Check it out because it will help you, particularly if you are a newbie to sewing. I I really do hope that this has given you an insight in what are the things you need and what are the things you can put off till a bit later in your hobby of sewing. I hope you enjoy it. Check out the other videos because they really will help you to get the things that you actually want and not to waste money by either under or overbuying. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.